problems, views, national oppression, sexism, anti-LGBTQ oppression, what it's like for the working class, the unions, the most low-paid workers. These types of issues are what we discussed yesterday. And we tried to discuss all the issues from a Marxist perspective, meaning an objective, scientific perspective. What are the objective factors or conditions going on in a certain struggle or situation or part of the world? Which class forces are at work? Do we see the hand of imperialism or of capitalism at work, which is usually yes as the answer. Who's fighting back? What are the forces? What are their, these kinds of questions and analysis help us to come to a perspective of how to fight these different capitalist and imperialist instigated crises that the working class and oppressed are always under, since capitalism is the predominant economic system now. But like every economic system that has come before, capitalism, despite what the capitalists tell us all the time, it too shall pass.
Yeah.
They'd like us to believe that what's going on in the world is just how it is, and the capitalists are going to have the upper hand always, and the U.S. especially is the epitome of democracy and wealth and all this and that, and it's brainwashed really into our heads from the earliest times, and certainly in the public schools like we heard about yesterday. So in order to educate our class, really what Workers' World Party is about is educating our class and reaching out to our class that there is a solution to all these problems. Okay, and the solution will not be found within the confines of the system, because the system absolutely has no solutions to the myriad of problems and crises and oppressions facing the working class. They have none. What have they done in Detroit? Have they made a solution to one aspect of anything no. But we have a program and we have answers, and Mike will be talking about that, the transitional program of how we participate in different struggles with the view of making the struggle very anti-capitalist and moving the participants in an anti-capitalist direction. But we don't feel it's enough to be anti-capitalist. We're socialists, we're communists. That's the future of humanity. That's the new economic system that will make sense. But in order to get there, we have to get rid of capitalism. And then we'll be able to build a new society where the working people run and control everything, where production and everything is done to benefit humanity and to take care and try and reverse the destruction that's been wreaked on the earth and its other inhabitants. So we have a vision of a socialist future. We think it is totally possible. This is the richest country in the world. It has a huge multinational working class that is already awakening in some sectors, like the low-wage workers. And what we envision is something that really working people naturally will move towards. I mean, we've had even in our mass work, we talk about not just anti-capitalism, but only socialism can fit. And nobody has a problem with that. In fact, when Occupy Wall Street happened and in 2011 and a little bit after that, there were surveys done, you know, what do you think about socialism? Are you for or against? And whatever that definition of socialism was to the person saying for or against, the majority was for. So it's not so far-fetched. People can learn Marxism, people can learn what it's like to have a different vision, people can learn how to work together cooperatively as comrades in the struggle. Things don't have to be how they are. So our panel on building a socialist future has 5 participants, and I think we will start in order with Mike Shane, and I'll switch places with you. Is that okay? Okay, and Mike will be talking on organizing and politicizing the working class and oppressed and the role of a transitional program in this struggle. Mike is a leading activist in the Moratorium Now Coalition, and he's done tremendous work throughout the city in coalition building, both in terms of stopping foreclosures and evictions, and now with the dealing with the mass water shutoffs in the city. Okay, Mike. Take my fruit.
That's not for me?
Oh,
No, I'm just kidding. Good morning, comrades and friends.
Morning.
Good morning. And it is a good morning. Today I want to discuss how we approach the incredibly important task of organizing our class, the working class, and the oppressed. The oppressed, which previous speakers have explained, are an integral part of the working class. All workers without or with jobs and youth who have yet to find a job are part of the working class. All workers are exploited by capitalism and imperialism, and this exploitation is the basis of their wealth and profits and the basis for our misery. But the oppressed members of our class, which include people of color, women, LGBTQ, immigrant workers, and workers with disabilities, as well as workers in the current and former colonies of the US, Europe, and Japan, suffer the additional burdens of racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ bigotry, and other forms of systemic discrimination. This oppression generates additional profits, or super profits, and wealth for the capitalist class. Before we can even advance demands for the working class as a whole as we fight for a socialist world, we must fight this oppression on an ongoing basis. The struggle against all forms of capitalist oppression forms the basis of the unity necessary for all workers, for all of us, to advance towards socialism and the liberation of humanity. A key component of this struggle is a recognition that the oppressed have the right to self-determination in the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. Without this, any struggle for a better world is doomed from the get-go. So how do we fight for socialism? How do we get workers, as a class, to progress towards socialism? Several speakers yesterday noted that the subjective conditions for socialism lag behind the objective conditions. And what does this mean? And how do we overcome this lag? Workers' World Party uses an approach called transitional demands. This approach was outlined by Leon Trotsky in a document entitled, this is a mouthful, The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, the mobilization of the masses around the transitional demands to prepare for the conquest of powers. We all call it the transitional program. It was really a draft program. It's in progress, it's still in progress, and that's what we'll talk about today. Trotsky pointed out 3 conditions that are necessary for the transition to socialism. First, the productive forces must be sufficiently developed for a new society to emerge. This condition was already met in the 19th century, and certainly in 1938 when Trotsky wrote this, and it's even more so today. Today, as in the 1930s, the productive forces, that is the economy, are stagnant. New inventions and technologies fail to lift the living standards of the workers as a whole. In fact, the capitalist system now is increasing poverty and hunger, unemployment and homelessness are growing, the schools are being destroyed, and public infrastructure is in serious state of decay. The financial system bounces from one crisis to another, and the imperialist wars continue unabated. Before one war is over, another one is started. Second, the second point, or the second objective condition, the working class, which includes the unemployed, must be sufficiently numerous and economically influential to impose its will and run society. In other words, it must be a majority in the country or capable of leading an alliance with farmers or peasants. Today, clearly, this condition has been met. Not only are workers a majority in the U.S., but across the world as a whole. We refer to these first two conditions as the objective conditions. The third condition, which is the problem, is the subjective factor. The workers must understand their own position in this society. They must understand that they are a class and that their class is in an irreconcilable conflict with the capitalist class. The working class must have its own organizations, and these organizations must not be captured completely by bourgeois ideology, as many in the U.S. are today. This condition is really what we got to work on. It's what's missing. The transitional demands are meant to address the glaring contradiction between the objective conditions and the subjective conditions. And that's where we are as a class today, all over the world. And this is what our job is, to move workers closer to match the objective conditions. In Trotsky's own words, quote, he wrote this in 1938, and you can see it's definitely applicable today. The language was a little antiquated. We don't speak this way necessarily to the masses. The strategic task of the next period, pre-revolutionary period of agitation, propaganda, and organization, consists in overcoming the contradiction between the maturity of the objective revolutionary conditions and the immaturity of the proletariat and its vanguard. And by that he means the confusion and disappointment of the older generation and the inexperience of the younger generation. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, also, we ran into this in Occupy. There's an impatience among the youth, and a lot of us, when I say a lot of us, I'm talking to older activists, there's definitely a generational divide. You know, we've got to overcome that. And that's why we're glad we're winning youth to our party today. Because there is this generational divide. We're like your grandparents, I know. But we're all in the same party, we live all in the same world. Trotsky continues, it is necessary to help the masses in the process of the daily struggle to find the bridge between the present demands and the socialist program of the revolution. This bridge should include a system of transitional demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat, end quote. In the period we're living today, every serious demand of the working class and the oppressed inevitably challenges capitalist property relations and the capitalist state in one way or another. We see this today in every struggle, no matter how big or small. That's especially true of the struggle for $15 an hour. Here you've heard the phrase D15. That's actually a Detroit phrase. That means Detroit 15. That's the name of the coalition. Elsewhere you call it different things, but that's the movement here. Whether it's the immigrant rights. I mean, you run right into the state, right into the racist opposition, and the bankruptcy here, of course. So and we all know this, every struggle is met with opposition by the ruling class or their local representatives. So how do we raise transitional demands? And that's what the bulk of this talk will be about. The transitional demands must be developed, and they must correspond to the current conditions. And although the objective conditions of the globe are very similar, the subjective conditions will vary from one continent to another, from one country to another, and even between different regions in the same country and between different industries. Again, D15 is an example of that. You know, there's a struggle erupting in the service industries, and it just doesn't include fast food workers. It includes the tellers in the banks. They're also minimum wage. They live on food stamps in the banks. This is the absurdity of the situation we live today. The variations in working class consciousness from one place to another and between different sectors of the economy must be considered when developing these demands. An example of the peculiarity in the working class in the U.S. is the desire to use the courts to address grievances and injustices. We hear it all the time, even within the unions. When I was a union steward, people would always tell me, look, this ain't going to work, I'm just going to go to court and sue. And it gets very frustrating because it implies a faith in this court system and in the state. And so that our job is to figure this out. So, in our transitional demands, we must consider lawsuits, but in combination with mass struggle in such a manner that the capitalist system and the role of the state is exposed, and the consciousness of at least a section of workers is raised and advanced. In fact, though, demands can sometimes be won in this manner. The demands that we develop must not be just economic demands, but they must include demands for basic democratic rights, especially for the most oppressed. This means that we fight laws designed to repress voting rights in bourgeois elections, or we fight for laws to grant full rights to immigrants. It may mean that we fight even for just wheelchair access to a polling place. One of the things that we need to do, though, is form mass organizations or strengthen the existing ones, including the unions. They need to organize and fight for demands that meet the immediate needs of our class and the oppressed. These organizations include progressive forces, not necessarily aligned with the party. And another way to do this is to intervene in bourgeois elections and raise a number of transitional demands all at once, while we also raise the specter of socialism. In Detroit, and I'll spend a lot of time on what we do in Detroit because we've learned a lot in the last 10 years, and we feel the party and the movement as a whole could benefit. In Detroit, we have two examples of mass organization. One is the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, or McCowie, and that was formed a long time ago to fight the imperialist war drive, initially with the invasion of Iraq. And then we've taken on opposition to all of the multitude of wars that have been launched since then by the U.S., but also by its junior partner, Israel, and by NATO. McCowie represents a left pole within the broader anti-war and peace movements and is a vehicle for expressing opposition to the warmongers in both the bourgeois parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, as well as groups like the Libertarians. McCowie also fights against racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ bigotry, and police brutality, and we fully support and advance the struggle for immigrant rights. In addition to organizing demonstrations, we also educate our class through teach-ins, forums, and leaflets. An example, in 2008, we organized a unique and historic teach-in on the formation of the Pentagon's AFRICOM and the growing and dangerous intervention of U.S. imperialism in Africa. And we may have been the only organization to do so in the Western world that I'm aware of, at least from the point of view of a mass struggle and from a leftist point of view. It was historic. And we had a follow-up, I think, last year to that conference, which was also unique. And at this point, the rest of the anti-war movement hasn't done so. But that's our role, is to spearhead and to focus attention on where the U.S. is going to plunder next. You know, Clausewitz said, war is an extension of politics by other means. We say war is an extension of the class struggle by other means. And we enter it with that perspective in mind, that we're going to wage class war against the ruling class. In opposition to the wars, we raise slogans that demand things like the immediate cessation of hostility and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from countries that the U.S. has invaded. Our opposition to the Pentagon war machine is crystal clear, as opposed to other people in the movement. We raise slogans demanding that the Pentagon budget be spent on human needs, such as jobs, schools, healthcare, and other social needs. Our class needs to understand the direct connection between the unmitigated war drive and our own declining standard of living. When the movement grows stronger and the consciousness sharpens, as it did during the Vietnam War, appropriate new demands are raised to address the changing subjective condition. And we do that to sharpen and clarify the struggle against imperialist war. During the Vietnam War period, a significant section of the anti-war movement understood the nature of U.S. imperialism, and many people expressed solidarity with the Vietnamese. The slogans transition to express full support for the Vietnamese by calling for the victory to the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. The slogan, "Stop the War in Black America," was also raised in order to link the struggle for the Vietnamese liberation to the struggle for black liberation, which was in full swing during the 1960s. In both of the slogans, "Victory to the NLF" and "Stop the War in Black America," illustrated the Leninist concept of the right of oppressed nations and peoples to self-determination against imperialism. Another group is the Moratorium Now Coalition. We formed it in 2008 to fight the foreclosures that were ripping Detroit, had already been ripping our neighborhoods for years. By the way, in 2006, long before anyone knew that there was a crisis, we knew in Detroit. If you were a homeowner trying to fix your house, in 2006, you could no longer get a home equity line of credit. All credit dried up for us 2 years before it did for anybody else in the U.S. I know because Debbie and I had trouble fixing our roof. So we were aware. That's why it's good to have comrades in all the areas of the country, because we see things happening before the rest of the country, before the working class is aware of what's going to hit us. We raised demands also, we raised demands regarding housing and utilities. We demanded an end to evictions and utility shutoffs, but most important, we called for a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions. We demanded that the Democratic governor, Jennifer Granholm, use her emergency powers granted to her by the Constitution of the state of Michigan to immediately stop all residential foreclosures and related evictions. We also pushed for a state law. Keep in mind, we're enamored with the legal system here, that would place a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions for 2 years. This was an eminently reasonable demand from the point of view of working people. In our agitation for this demand, we found that almost all people that we encountered thought that it made complete sense and was a reasonable solution to the crisis. Our class saw that people would be kept in their homes, our children's education would not be disrupted by the evictions, and that the destruction of our neighborhoods by the banks would stop. The actual cost to the taxpayers was minimal, mainly to cover the cost to administer the moratorium, but it was a direct challenge to the bank's right to private property. Democratic governor, and I keep saying Democrat because we know that everyone thinks that Democrats are friends of the working people, and that's one of the subjective conditions that we need to bust up. She opposed it because, quote, in her own words, the banks wouldn't like it. That's the point, right? And politicians of both parties would not support it, and many others expressed outright opposition. The campaign against foreclosures accomplished several things, even though we did not win a moratorium. First, activists did stop some evictions through mass mobilization. Second, we learned the true nature of the court system and the capitalist state. The activists learned that the system is not neutral, that the courts are instruments of capitalist rule. Third, the concept of a moratorium spread throughout the country and has been adopted by every serious anti-foreclosure group that we've come into contact, whether they're in California, in the Midwest, in Chicago, or on the East Coast. Well, we were, to my knowledge, the first group to raise it, and everyone now understands it. I actually went to a conference 2 years ago where there was initially some reticence to adopt the moratorium. Every one of those groups has now adopted it because they see it as the only solution to the crisis, and the banks are terrified by it. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are terrified by it because we're going after our money, basically. And more people are beginning to understand this. Fourthly, though, it gave the party and other activists locally here experience in mass organizing. It provided a practical tutorial on the banks and their role in society and prepared us for the next big battle against the banks. The orchestrated bankruptcy of the city of Detroit and the attack on workers' pensions, public jobs, and public assets. Over the past 2 years, Moratorium Now is engaged in a spirited defense of our class in the racist ruling class assault on Detroit. Moratorium Now joined a broad array of forces to defend the right of workers, especially black workers, to vote and elect their own representatives, no matter how rotten these elected officials were or are. We used the bankruptcy court in combination with mass intervention through demonstration, packing the court, agitation and propaganda on the ground to fight the banks, and we were successful in one thing. We actually reduced the size of the swap termination fees by $200 million, and that benefited all of us, and it showed that we could win against the banks. We raised the slogan, "Make the banks pay." At first it was, it's those commies, Moratorium Now. You know, they're the ones doing this. Yeah, there are other independents in there, but it's not as common shots. Well, at the onset of the struggle, it was lonely. We were out there by ourselves, but the rank and file of all those groups identified with the slogan. Now it's universally accepted across Detroit. This transitional demand was not only understood by grassroots activists, but when we went into all the neighborhoods, they got it. They saw what the banks did to our neighborhoods. They understood the banks already got bailed out, and it was time to get our piece of the pie, so to speak. And by the way, we're frustrated sometimes because we think the masses don't know what's going on. But we found that they know a lot more than people give them credit for. They're struggling to survive, and they got to prioritize. You know, getting food for your child for the next morning is way more important than coming to a meeting, at least right now for a lot of people, and how they balance and manage their time. One thing about transitional demands, though, is that they're not static. When we first entered this campaign, we called for a moratorium on all debt payments to the banks. Kevin Orr came into the picture. He's the emergency manager appointed by Snyder, but he's a direct representative of Wall Street. For comrades who aren't in Detroit, Kevin Orr managed part of the Chrysler bankruptcy. He comes from a firm called Jones Day, which, by the way, Scalia did his early work in back in the 70s. That shows you how rotten they are. But their main clients are the banks. He was appointed as our official representative in bankruptcy court. He represents, or his colleagues, he resigned, of course, from Jones Day.
He'll be back.
But when he declared a moratorium on bank payments, part of the bank payments, that fax was sent from the Jones Day office in Cincinnati. I'm not lying. Publicly, there's this facade, I'm independent of Jones Day. So why do you have to use their offices to announce the moratorium? Well, as soon as he did that, we shifted our demand to cancel, not have a moratorium, but to cancel all of that. Okay? And our activists in Moratorium Now understood it, and we made a big banner, 12 feet long, that says cancel the debt, the bank's debt. And that banner, by the way, and this is a lesson that we all need, this is part of organizing, it showed up all around the world every time anyone covered what was going on in Detroit. And sometimes we had 4 people at the picket line, 2 people holding the banner, and others holding a leaflet. Because we did this all the time. The masses can't sustain necessarily right now the level of activity that we had against the bankruptcy court. But it didn't matter if it was just 4 people. It was a nice picture. It showed up everywhere. in Asia, in Europe. Bloomberg News, over and over again, Bloomberg News, warning the ruling class on what we're up to. It even showed up for a day in a commercial by Honda Motor Company. But they had to pull it because it wasn't just for that. It was they were saying that Detroit was dead, and it upset a lot of people. But it was cool that they used our picture. So keep that in mind that, you know, these slogans on banners have the effect of repeating. How do we learn things, Joe? By repetition. That's a common thing, and the teachers know you got to repeat. The ruling class knows this. They repeat a lie over and over and over again. We have to repeat the simple truths over and over and over again until it penetrates the masses. We do it through our agitation, but the banners and our picket signs are very important. One activist from out of town, he came to one of our demonstrations. It was a big one, and he said to me, "Hey, you guys are everywhere," because no one else does what we do. But it's not important that moratorium now on the bottom was visible. It was a slogan: make the banks pay, stop the banks, those kind of slogans. And people would grab those picket signs. We have to constantly make new ones because they take them home. They want them. And that's a good thing. Next, we took on the water struggle, which everybody in the world knows about now. Comrade Chris was the first to raise opposition to the inhumane water shutoffs in bankruptcy court. After that, there was a flood of opposition from other community members who raised that it opened the door so other people stepped forward and recounted in bankruptcy court exactly what was going on in the communities. She raised that it was an outright violation of human rights, which had some certain nerve with people everywhere. I don't care who you are. It's water, because of its biological necessity, it turns out to be a very uniting factor. Everybody understands it. But Chris also raised the swap termination fees that we paid, the people of Detroit paid, in the tune of $537 million out of infrastructure bond money. This is supposed to fix infrastructure. Not fix infrastructure of the banks on Wall Street, but to fix real infrastructure in the city of Detroit and in the suburbs. A few weeks ago, we saw what happens when you don't do that. Millions, if not billions of dollars in damage done to public infrastructure, but also people's homes because the water could not drain fast enough. By the way, if any of us took out a loan and we specified that we were going to use it to buy X, Y, or Z, and then we spent it on A, B, or C, we'd be in court and probably in jail. But it doesn't happen. And this is another thing we need to drive home to the masses. But actually, people already know there's a dual standard, and actually it's a triple standard. There's one for the banks, then for the workers, white workers mainly, there's another one, and then for the oppressed, especially black people, there's a third version. It's obvious to the most oppressed that there's more than one system.
Black politicians.
Yes, black politicians are targeted. It's no accident that the bankruptcy occurred after Kwame Kilpatrick was convicted for really relatively petty crimes. But they timed everything using the local media to advance the struggle for bankruptcy and to sow confusion among the working class as to what caused the bankruptcy. They think that a little bit of bribe money, they were implying that a little bit of money caused the bankruptcy of Detroit. That's absurd. This fraud is an endemic feature of American political life. It has been that way since the early 1800s. But anyway, this intervention, which it wasn't just Chris going into court and us packing the court. We had demonstrations. We had a big one. The nurses came in. We had a 2,000, 3,000 people demonstration. People were arrested at civil disobedience. We had the Canadians filing on behalf of Detroiters a human rights complaint that got a very nice response and actually electrified the movement and put the struggle on the map. We got a temporary moratorium on water shutoffs. Even the judge said, this is not helping the bankruptcy at all, proceedings. And it makes Detroit look bad. No, it makes the banks look bad. It makes us look good because we step forward. And it wasn't just moratorium now. Groups, every group that had a progressive ounce of progressiveness in their blood stepped forward in their own ways to denounce this. Nurses, doctors, not just outside but inside the city. Church groups expressed their opposition. It was the UN, everybody did. And yesterday we had the UAW local from Chicago come in, deliver 5,000 gallons of water. We all know that doesn't solve the problem, but it's a symbolic show of solidarity, which is very, very important. Okay. All right, almost done.
Don't count that page turn.
Okay. But as we struggle against the banks, we also raised other slogans, which are transitional demands. We called for reparations from the banks for destroying Detroit's neighborhoods. And when we raise this in the neighborhoods, people understand. We also demand that a jobs program be funded by the banks and the corporations that looted Detroit. A lot of this destruction was, and Eric, I think you alluded to what happened. They pulled out of Detroit consciously. They actually started in the 50s, but there was a mass exodus after that. And every time they pulled a series of plants out of Detroit in the last 30 years, the destruction of the neighborhoods accelerated. Unemployment skyrocketed. So that's why we continuously raise these demands. I just want to also point out one other thing, because sometimes we get flack. Why are we just focusing, for example, right now on the $537 million that the banks got for terminating the swaps and not all the bank debt? Well, we're in bankruptcy court. That's a mass demand that we continue to raise through our slogans that all the debt should be canceled. But in bankruptcy court, we're framed by certain legal boundaries, and the system has defined fraud in their own way. And using their definition of fraud, we can recover that $537 billion. If we want to expand that definition of fraud, it's the mass struggle that it expands it. Now, in Alabama, a public sewage department actually got it. The excess money they paid off the swap termination, they got it all back. They didn't even take it to trial. They won in arbitration. The bank knew that they were going to lose. We want our representatives, Kevin Orr and Jones Day, to do it. Right. In fact, they repeatedly express lack of knowledge about these swaps. I'm not lying.
Maybe they don't, they just don't care.
They actually, no, they actually will say, what swaps are you talking about? They've said it in the mediation over the recent, the intervention by lawyers in the bankruptcy court trying to extend the moratorium. They told me that on a conference call. They grouped us into groups of 10 to address our objections to the bankruptcy, and actually had to argue with the Jones Day clown at the other end of the phone and say, no, these swaps were paid in 2012 and 2011. I identified it in my objection. And he goes, no. We're talking about that in court now. I said, no, those are the swaps related to the pensions, not to the water department. And after back and forth that went on for minutes, he said, oh, I see what you're talking about. We'll get back to you on that. Then they go to the progressive lawyers, and they still haven't gotten back to us. On that call, they also said the foreclosure crisis had nothing to do with the current crisis of the city of Detroit in bankruptcy. They said it was my opinion. Was my opinion, and the opinion of Bloomberg News, and the opinion of everybody else in the world. And it's no accident that many of the cities that are in bankruptcy now have been hit by foreclosures on the scale of Detroit. It's no accident. And I just want to mention one thing about foreclosures. Ferguson, Missouri, 50% of the homes are underwater.
Oh.
That's another way that's like Detroit. We probably have 80 or 90% underwater, but we're very much like that. In Ferguson, their schools have been attacked, just like the schools here. Many, many similarities. That's why we look with optimism at the response to the mass, to the struggle, or to the police brutality in Ferguson. I mentioned an electoral intervention because intervention in the bourgeois elections gives us another way to raise transitional demands. But when we intervene, we also call openly for socialism. And that accomplishes two things. We educate people on reasonable demands, but we win over the best workers to the party. We intervened in the bourgeois elections in 2006. The Green Party invited McCowie to field a slate called Stop the War Slate. And it wasn't quite the same as a party intervention, because what we were able to do is raise all the transitional demands, or a number of them that were appropriate to this crisis. And Chris, in fact, in 2006, called for a moratorium on foreclosures. That's how far ahead of everybody else we were. It wasn't really a place to raise socialism. I mean, we were on the Green Party ticket, but we raised all the transitional demands. You know, we covered employment, funding of cities, struggle against war, struggle against racism. At the time, I think the affirmative action battle was going on in Detroit. You know, we talked about that. We talked about all the oppressions and raised the consciousness. And I'm sure in the future the party will again intervene in elections, because that's where the masses are right now. They focus on the elections, and as unfortunate as it is, they still look to the parties, the bourgeois parties, to resolve their problems. That's starting to go away, but it'll be with us for a while until the struggle really erupts. What we've discussed in our so far transitional demands. Our party raises transitional demands all the time in our mass organizing. A comprehensive and thoughtfully conceived collection of these demands, however, that addresses the current state of the working class in the U.S. is called a transitional program. And right now for us, it's my view that the transitional program is a work in progress. When we have conferences, comrades in other branches or from the center, we raise what you would call a transitional program. But we don't have one that you can find on the party websites that says this is what we're about. But, you know, if you work with us, you know what we're about. But we're a growing party, and as we mature, we'll start to see this thing develop, hopefully sooner than later. In closing, I'd like to say that in our mass work, though, fighting for transitional demands is not enough. When we go out there, we distribute Workers' World paper in order to expose our class to socialism and in order to win over the most conscious workers to a socialist perspective and to our party. This is very important. We cannot divorce our mass work from party building efforts. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. And I want to emphasize how important this is. Sometimes we don't have a leaflet. We go to an action. People know we're at moratorium now, but they also know that we'll bring a Workers' World newspaper. The paper acts as a leaflet, if you have nothing else, and it presents our perspective, and it shows what we're about. You can look in the paper and see all over the United States and around the world what kinds of things we're involved in. And we also hold public meetings in the name of the party. We have mass meetings to, build the struggle. The Food is a Right, People's Assembly is an excellent example of that. We do similar things like that in Detroit. But that's not enough either. We've got to all start having, all the branches, I feel, need to have regular party meetings to win over the advanced workers. In addition to raising the consciousness of the class as a whole, we've got to win over the best ones to a socialist, a fighting socialist perspective, because there's no substitute for a party. Thank you.
All right.